Nigel Nelson, Britain's longest-serving political editor. You've worked on a range of newspapers. The day after this interview is broadcast on Monday. We formally become colleagues. You are GBNews' senior political commentator. I'm going to ask you a question which I have been asked so many times. Why is a lefty like you coming to join GB News?
Because the one thing that GB News actually really believes in is free speech. So I've made plenty of appearances there. Often I don't get on with the presenter or we don't agree, and the same thing applies to the panellists. But at no point has anyone ever stopped me having my say. So I'm really looking forward to joining GB News to continue having my say.
So you, throughout your career, you have covered many prime ministers. You're now on your 9th prime minister.
They're like sort of medals, aren't they? Campaign medals, yeah.
I mean, you sort of managed to ratchet it up in the last couple of years because we've had...
Yeah, we've had an awful lot, yeah.
Who stands out for you? One or two people?
The two who really stand out are Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. And I think that what they show is that to be a successful prime minister, you need an underlying political philosophy, which they both had. Margaret Thatcher was the free market, Tony Blair, his cherry picking from left and right. And that sort of stood them in good stead to stay there for 3 elections. So they come as top of my list. Of course, they both then disappear because of major mistakes. Tony Blair, obviously, because of Iraq. Margaret Thatcher because of poll tax. But they were successful for the time that they were in power.
Is it fair to ask if you have liked any particular prime minister more than any of the other 8?
It's perfectly fair to ask that I certainly liked Tony Blair. I enjoyed his company. I like John Major very much. I think that he was traduced as the grey man, which I don't think he actually was. I also enjoyed David Cameron's company. I think that David Cameron was a bit like Tony Blair. Margaret Thatcher absolutely terrified me when I met her.
Did she?
Yeah, absolutely. That she'd hit you with those laser blue eyes and everyone would melt. But I watched cabinet ministers melting too, so I wasn't alone.
And are there, because you've seen prime ministers rise and fall, as you said, are there any anecdotes you can share with us which give us an insight into how they fall?
Well, I mean, one example would be the fall of Margaret Thatcher, which was the nearest thing to the mayhem of last year. So I was at a party conference. Cecil Parkinson was then Transport Secretary, and he was dining at a table next door to me in the conference hotel. He got louder and louder as the evening went on and began attacking the entire cabinet. And his most memorable phrase was, "If the cabinet was a racehorse, I wouldn't put a bet on it." And then he rubbished individual cabinet colleagues.
Wow, and you could hear...
I could hear all this going on. So a notebook came out under my table, jotting down all these various phrases. It made a splash in the Sunday People that Sunday. And then there was a big question about whether I'd acted ethically. My view is it was in the public interest. He was talking in a public place. He wasn't talking to me on any kind of lobby terms. So I think it was ethical, but I certainly got in the neck for doing it.
That's really interesting. I mean, I'm assuming that drink had been taken by Cecil Parkinson.
Indeed it had.
Do you think that our politicians used to drink more than they perhaps do now?
Yes, absolutely. When I joined the House of Commons in 1986, the place floated on a sea of alcohol. And there were MPs who had too much time on their hands and spent most of it in the bars. I mean, you even had situations where MPs were being propped up by colleagues to go through the voting lobbies. That's gradually changed, and I think that is now much better. They drink much more responsibly. They still drink, but not anything like they used to. And certainly the lunches where you might see 3 bottles of wine go down, now it's a couple of bottles of water.
Really? Depressing. I used to enjoy those lunches with bottles of wine, but I could see it was on its way out during my time. So it's interesting what you said about John Major, because we have in our minds as voters, we ascribe personalities to the various prime ministers. So Margaret Thatcher, strong, John Major, boring. But you say he wasn't boring.
No, not at all. No, I was at a private dinner with him during a party conference, whereupon he got incredibly drunk. And
really?
Yeah, absolutely. He was very lively, and he got hugely drunk and started singing the theme song from the 1950s radio show, Much Binding in the Marsh. And he was singing that to the table. He was then Chancellor, and he was making his big economic speech the following day.
He was Chancellor?
He was Chancellor at the time. And I was sitting next to his wife, Norma, and she'd been very snippy to him through the whole evening. And I thought, ooh, these two don't seem to get on very well. What I didn't know at that particular time was that only a couple of weeks previously, she'd found out about his affair with Edwina Currie.
You must have been... I mean, we were all really shocked by that revelation.
I think it was the most shocking thing I've ever heard in politics. Certainly the most surprising, that when we first heard about it, we were at a different party conference, and I was dining with a few journalist colleagues, and the moment that the news came through, we all rushed out of the restaurant to try and get a signal on our mobile phones to go and tell London. My editor thought I'd been drinking, because he didn't believe it.
You mentioned Norma Major there. Do you think the role of the Prime Minister's spouse has changed in your long tenure?
Probably it changed a bit, I think, with David Cameron, that in the sense that a spouse has decided to actually try and take much more of a back seat, I think, after that. I think, yes, that they play much less a role, and a lot of that is to do with protecting families, which I can understand. It's the Prime Minister who is the one who is elected, and understandably they don't want too much scrutiny on their family, which I think probably is fair enough.
Political journalists are subject to some quite unique and strict rules about how they work, because they have offices in the Palace of Westminster, the lobby team, as it were. You were expelled for 20
breaking the rules,
days
yes.
for breaking the rules. Talk me through it.
Well, this was in Betty Boothroyd's day when she was Speaker. She'd been progressively not liking things I was writing, and...
what were you writing?
Well, I mean, the one example was that I was writing a story about a used condom being found near the Speaker's chair. And I was then hauled in by the Sergeant-at-Arms, which is a very odd experience, to have a rollicking from the Sergeant-at-Arms, a man wearing women's tights with a sword on the table in front of you. But that was just a telling off. The next time, there was a story that came through about MPs receiving booby-trap mail from animal rights activists, and the police thought it might have been contaminated with anthrax. I wrote the story, Betty Boothroyd objected to it, expelled me from the House of Commons for 20 sitting days. I moved into the Red Lion pub nearby and had 6 weeks in a pub to go and work in, which was great.
You talked about how the drinking culture has changed. Has the booing and braying, the images in the House of Commons that voters see every week at Prime Minister's Question Time, has that stayed about the same? Has it got worse? Has it got better in your experience?
No, that's been about the same.
Right.
Why
do they do it? It's such a bad image to put across the public.
It is a bad image. I think they can't help themselves. But no, that has actually that has been a consistent all through the 36 years I've been there. The biggest change I've noticed is I think that the quality of debate is much less. And this is something that, in fact, happens in the whole country. We've now got to a stage, I think, partly because of the divisions caused by Brexit and still causing divisions, partly to do with social media. Everything now seems to have to be black and white. You are a Brexiteer or you're a Remainer. There's no kind of grey area in between. People are very sort of certain about their position on transgender issues, colonialism, slavery, COVID vaccines. And that has infected the House of Commons, so you find MPs are rather similar. And the whole point of debate is to listen, to learn, even change your mind during it. And that's what's lacking at the moment. Final
question. Your best political headline or your best scoop? Choose which one you like.
Oh, I think the best scoop's got to be Cecil Parkinson eavesdropping on him. There's no question of that.
Did he ever speak to you after that?
Yes, but not in a terribly friendly way.
Well, I will always talk to you in a friendly way. Our
Thank
viewers
you.
are looking forward to seeing even more of you than they have already, and I'm certainly looking forward to formally being colleagues come tomorrow. Nigel Nelson.
Me too.
Thank you.